Little did I know today, as I was leaving my office, when I grabbed this copy of Georgia Trend magazine, the significance that it may play, particularly given the fact that Raphael wasn't here when I arrived or most of you arrived. I thought the picture may be all that we were going to get, because we all know how Griff Lynch is at the port. If he can snag somebody, he might not pay attention to your schedule, but fortunately, he arrived after having, I believe, been able to go up in a crane, and I'm not sure, did you unload one or two ships while you were up there? Just one, three, all right. But it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Raphael Bostic, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He is currently a voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee, the monetary policy-making body of the Federal Reserve System. So you saw some of his handiwork on display last week. Dr. Bostic took office on June 5th, 2017 as the 15th President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He is responsible for all of the bank's activities, including monetary policy, bank supervision and regulation, and payment services. From 2012 to 2017, prior to arriving at the bank, he was the Judith and John Bedrosian Chair in Governance and Public Enterprise at the Saul Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. Dr. Bostic arrived at USC in 2001 and served as professor in the School of Policy, Planning, and Development. His research has spanned many fields, including home ownership, housing finance, neighborhood change, and the role of institutions in shaping policy effectiveness. From 2009 to 2012, he was the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. In that role, he was the principal advisor to the Secretary on Policy and Research, helping the Secretary and other principal staff make informed decisions on HUD policies and programs, as well as on budget and legislative proposals. Dr. Bostic actually worked at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors from 1995 to 2001, first as an economist and then as a senior economist in the Monetary and Financial Services section, where his work on the Community Reinvestment Act earned him a Special Achievement Award. He served as a special assistant to HUD's Assistant Secretary of Policy Development and Research in 1999. He was also a professional lecturer at American University in 1998. I need to find in here all the degrees that he holds. You want me to skip all of those? They were similar to mine. So I thought we might just touch on those, Raphael, if that's all right with you. The only thing about his late arrival was I was fully prepared and engaged in about 15 to 20 minutes of intellectual sparring on economic policy, both from a historical perspective as well as its impact on globalization in the world today, which he's a little more prepared to discuss, as he graduated from Harvard University in 1987 with a combined major in economics and psychology, and earned his doctorate in economics from Stanford University in 1995. So Cliff McCurry, as I often hear Holden Hayes say, it's not just now that everybody can't get into the University of Georgia. Finally, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta serves the 6th Federal Reserve District, which covers Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. The bank has branches in Birmingham, Jacksonville, Miami, Nashville, and New Orleans. So, as I ask Dr. Bostic to join me at the podium, I ask that you be inspired by the words of a former Fed Chairman, Alan Greenspan. It's one of my absolute favorite quotes, and I quote, "I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant."
So I've gotten some interesting introductions before. That was right there at the top. That was very, very, very good. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to be here. Thank you for accommodating my tardiness. We actually, Griff did let us out on time. We just took meandering way to get here. So I got to see a lot of Savannah, and it's a very pretty town you have here, so it's really good to be here. The port is really an interesting thing. One of the things we try to do in our time, what I've tried to do a lot of, is get around and go to see the economic drivers and the engines that are so important to the economy of the 6th District and of Georgia. And today was really, it hit the mark in terms of getting a good sense of the scale and the promise of the port. So I was really grateful to be here, and it's good to see you all. I'll also say that I'm a member of the Rotary up in Atlanta, so this counts as my weekly meeting. So I'm very, very happy about that, and now I don't have to, they know I'm doing this, so that's good. As I'm sure you know, the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, voted to increase the federal funds rate target range by 25 basis points last week. Today, what I thought I would do is explain why I think that action made sense, and do that in the context of current economic conditions and my economic outlook for how the economy is going to work moving forward. Then I want to spend some time discussing economic resilience, particularly with regard to approaches we can take here in Georgia. Now, I want to offer my usual disclaimer before I get started, which is everything I say today is just my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for anyone else in the Federal Reserve System or for the FOMC. So let's begin with how the U.S. economy is performing at mid-year. It appears to be in a pretty good place. Unemployment is at its lowest rate since the early 2000s, and inflation is running close to 2%. And as I've said recently, the economy is about as close to target as we've ever seen over this expansion. That doesn't mean, though, that the FOMC can go on recess until conditions change. I think actually the opposite is true now. The job of a monetary policymaker is becoming more difficult. For the past 9 years, the Fed's goal has been to help bring the economy back to a more normal place following the financial crisis. Now, with conditions reasonably close to the FOMC's dual mandate of full employment in the context of stable prices, the real work begins. We'll continue to pick apart the incoming economic data and combine it with real-time information from our business contacts as we set the path forward. And our goal is to keep this expansion going in a sustainable manner. We want to ensure that the economy is not overheating, but we also don't want monetary policy to become too restrictive and threaten to choke off the expansion. It does appear that the growth of real gross domestic product this quarter will come in above my previous estimate. But I suspect that some of this strength is tied to transitory or idiosyncratic factors that do not signal a major shift in momentum. On the consumer side, the recent spending data look to have picked up a bit. However, much of the recent bump in expenditures on services can be tied to a spike in spending on utilities due to unusual weather patterns. Most of our reports from businesses that are tied to the consumer sector indicate no discernible change in the pace of spending relative to recent trends. So I'm taking a bit of a wait-and-see approach with the recent consumer data. In a similar way, I am not inclined to read too much into the recent acceleration in business investment growth. A fair amount of that pickup is due to a rebound in spending on structures related to the mining and energy sector. Excluding energy and oil investment is still below 5% on a year-by-year basis, and that's a bit lower than the typical expansion average. Regarding my outlook, my projection for overall growth hasn't changed materially since the beginning of the year. I still see output growth at a moderate, above-trend pace this year and the next, and then expect it to slow to a pace that corresponds with the longer-run potential of the economy, which is slightly less than 2%. Given that the unemployment rate is already low by historical standards, and that I expect growth to continue to outpace potential, one obvious concern I have is whether the economy is beginning to overheat in a destabilizing way. Here, I think it is important to recognize an important unknown. Most economists believe that even in periods of strong economic growth, some employment is inevitable or natural. This is either due to the structure of labor markets or arises from typical flows of workers entering and exiting the labor market. But the natural rate is unknown and has to be inferred from available data. In last week's policy meeting, estimates from FOMC participants of the natural rate range between 4.1 and 4.7%. According to these estimates, the current unemployment rate is already below its natural rate. But we don't need to go back that far in history to see how much the committee's thinking on this concept has changed. Back in September of 2014, a little less than 4 years ago, estimates of the longer-run natural unemployment rate were between 5 and 6%. My point here is that these estimates are not set in stone. In my mind, the most informative data for uncovering the natural rate comes from the nominal side of the economy, that is inflation and wage growth. Regarding inflation, I have not seen a dramatic shift in inflation expectations or measured retail price inflation. As for wage growth, I have yet to see evidence that it is accelerating at an unsustainable pace. In fact, aggregate wage growth appears to have flattened out over the past year or so at levels that appear to be in line with economic fundamentals. Most of the Atlanta Fed's business contacts characterize labor markets as tight, but not many of them plan to respond by raising wages across the board. I do hear some reports of planned accelerations in wages and salaries, but just as often, I hear that the issue is one of attracting sufficiently qualified workers. In these cases, firms are focusing on developing and training internal candidates and increasing investments in automation. Reports of building price pressures are also sporadic. Although rising energy prices and anticipated tariff-related costs are generating more reports of upward price movement along the supply chain, we see few indications that the affected businesses expect to pass costs along to the final consumer. The recent data on retail prices suggests inflation is running at or very near the FOMC's 2% goal, and I expect it to continue in that neighborhood over the next few years. I began the year with a decided upside tilt to my risk profile for growth, reflecting business optimism following the passage of tax reform. However, that optimism has almost completely faded among my contacts, replaced by concerns about trade policy and tariffs. Perceived uncertainty has risen markedly. Projects already underway are continuing, but I get the sense that the bar for new investment is currently quite high. Risk-off behavior seems to be the dominant sentiment among my contacts. In response, I've shifted the risks to my growth outlook to balanced. Should the recent data unfold in a manner similar to my outlook, I am comfortable continuing to move policy toward a more neutral stance, one where monetary policy is neither accommodative nor restrictive. The level of the policy rate that qualifies as neutral, though, is not something that we know with precision. But I can tell you we are getting close to the lower part of most plausible estimates of the neutral rate. I don't think we're quite at neutral yet, even after last week's hike. But a key policy question going forward is how many more rate increases are required to complete the transition to a policy stance that is neither accommodative nor restrictive. Now I'd like to shift my focus away from policy and talk about some factors that promote economic resilience in communities over time. I think this topic is particularly significant for smaller and mid-sized cities like Savannah. One of the most important factors in creating the potential for positive economic outcomes is the presence of economic dynamism. That means a healthy amount of churning in a local or regional economy. Here at the Atlanta Fed, we recently published the second version of our Small City Economic Dynamism Index. And you can get a copy of the report on our website under Community Development. Now, in this report, we rank more than 400 small and mid-sized U.S. cities across 13 indicators of broad dynamism in 4 categories: demographics, economics, human and social capital, and infrastructure. Each indicator in the index has been shown to correlate with positive community and economic development outcomes. The index includes growth metrics, as well as what we might call opportunity metrics. Growth metrics carry information on things like population growth, employment growth, and population densification. which is a measure of the movement of people back into the city center. By these measures, Savannah and its peer cities in Georgia look pretty good over the past decade. Opportunity metrics include the rate of growth of poverty, median household income, and educational attainment. And here we see a mixed picture. Educational attainment seems to be improving, as measured by the share of people who have a bachelor's degree or higher. On the other hand, poverty and median incomes are moving in the wrong direction. So even in cities where employment is growing, like Savannah, median household income and poverty rates have not shown positive progress. In these places, we are learning that job growth alone is insufficient if these jobs are not accessible because of transportation barriers or mismatched worker skills. Another issue is that many of the jobs being created are low wage and don't allow families to rise above the deeper challenges of poverty. This pattern, some indications of growth, accompanied by deepening pockets of distress and poverty, is especially pronounced in the Southeast. And that means it's a significant concern for the Atlanta Fed, whose district spans the 6 states within the region. So what can be done to improve economic outcomes? Community-based investment is one way to think about the kinds of local investments that help to translate growth into community assets that expand opportunity. Primarily, we're talking about either direct investment into projects or passive investments into intermediaries or funds that create housing, charter schools, facilities, and infrastructure projects, especially those that serve low-income families. And more often, we're seeing community-based investments focused on programs and services that have historically been funded exclusively with public dollars. These include things like early childhood education, prisoner recidivism, health interventions, and even workforce development. In markets where growth is creating development pressure and where socioeconomic outcomes lag, community-based investments like these can be viable pathways to improving conditions of distress while also generating a financial return. So you might be thinking, where does community investment come from? Well, some of it comes from government programs. Some of it comes from banks, motivated by regulations like the Community Reinvestment Act. But foundations also play a role, and they provide a lot of subsidized capital for community-based investment. And these dollars can lead other investors, they can mitigate risk creatively, and they can seed innovations. My team at the Atlanta Fed took a look at where foundations and other non-governmental grant providers are investing in community and economic development. This research, which we call Following the Money, examined grants from larger foundations and other intermediaries that fill gaps in funding where the market or local tax revenues come up short. So how did Savannah do in attracting these grants? From 2009 to 2014, the U.S. median metro area attracted $3.75 per capita each year in combined funding from large grant makers. By comparison, on average, the Savannah area attracted only about $2 per capita in this kind of subsidy each year. So just to be clear, these measures are adjusted for population. So compared to Atlanta and other smaller and mid-sized cities in Georgia, Savannah is attracting the fewest subsidy dollars from the outside to address community and economic development issues. So given that, you may be wondering, what does it take to attract these sorts of community-based investment dollars? Now, many of Georgia's smaller and mid-sized cities, including Savannah, are growing, but they're also wrestling with difficult challenges such as poverty, stagnant incomes, blight, and vacancy. The community-based investment framework offers a way to think about connecting growth to broader opportunity. As one of my staff members, Will Lamb, likes to say, community-based investments and community-based investors are like airplanes. They're flying around looking for opportunities that meet their particular interests. And those interests might include projects in housing, in charter schools, community facilities, small business incubators, and so on. But for these investments to land and create the outcomes, there must be runways. And there's a whole set of intermediaries that build runways: public-private partnerships, community development financial institutions, community development corporations, and a constellation of nonprofit organizations that absorb community-based investment. These intermediaries allow the investments to land where they can create positive outcomes. And intermediaries do this by coordinating shared priorities, by creating a pipeline of investment opportunities, and by working with public officials to ensure that the environment is amenable to community investment. If the goal is to connect growth to broader opportunity and to attract more community-based investment from local sources, as well as from those outside of our market, then we need to build more runways. We need those runways to be visible and well lit, meaning that we need a clear pipeline of community-based investment opportunities that take economic advantage of the growth we are experiencing to broaden the opportunity for people living in conditions of economic distress. As I see it, this group gathered here today, my fellow Rotarians, you have the resources, you have the aligned interests, and also the capacity to build and augment Savannah's runways. We here at the Atlanta Fed stand ready to help you do that and make a difference. So thank you all, and I'd like to take some questions if you have any.
When you mention these foundations, what specifically, do you have any good examples? Is it like specifically to solve poverty or homelessness, or is it across the board everything?
So there are lots of different foundations. Most foundations, when they're founded, have a mission associated with them. And so part of I think the task for Savannah and all of our cities is to first be clear on what your priorities are. What are the things where you feel like a difference can be made? And then make that known. And what, in my experience, has been, if you let us know, we'll get in touch with our network of foundation contacts and make sure that the ones that have those interests as part of their mission are aware and come find out what you guys are doing. When I think about these foundations, things like the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and there are many others that are national, but there are also some that, like in Atlanta, we have the Woodruff Foundation out from Coca-Cola. There are many resources that are available, and we have, as part of our mission, and this started before I got to the Fed, a goal of really increasing the amount of investment that happens in the 6th District. If you look at the Following the Money report that I mentioned, the Southeast is underinvested at the national level. And we want to do all we can to make sure that that situation changes so that the needs that exist in our communities get as much support as they possibly can.
Economic situation in rural Georgia. Georgia is still primarily, in much of the Southeast, still primarily rural, where there's been endemic lack of employment for generations and very little opportunity for employment. Have you seen any areas in Georgia that have done a better job than others in terms of trying to develop their communities so that they're more economically viable?
So the question is, what are we seeing in the rural parts of the district? So thank you for the question. And I would say that one thing that I've became immediately aware of when I got to Atlanta was that, you have large, vibrant cities. You have Atlanta, you got Nashville, you have Savannah to some extent, you have Miami. But then if you look at the map, you have everywhere else. And if you think about the state of Georgia as one example, I think the statistic is in the last 5 years, 70% of the growth in jobs in Georgia has occurred in 11 counties. And Georgia has 159 counties. And so that means there are 148 other counties where there's a different reality. And so we've actually started an initiative. I'm going to smaller places. I was in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, about a couple months ago, going to Macon. I'm going to try to get in touch with a bunch of cities that are not in that high mover space, and try to understand their challenges, and on one level, really just talk to them about how the economy works. One thing I've come to believe is that most people don't have a deep understanding of how the economy works. If you listen to CNBC and all that kind of stuff, you're going to hear people who are going to talk about the economy in a way so that you have to listen to them tomorrow, and not so that you can figure out what solutions you might be wanting to embrace. And so we're going to talk to them. In terms of what works, that's going to be at the end of my initiative. So I'm going to see a lot of places. I will tell you, one thing that is very important is a clarity of mission and self, but also finding ways to achieve scale. Because if you want to attract a large employer, the thing that you're going to have to convince them is that you're going to have a continuous source of labor, of workers. And if you only have a couple thousand people in a county, that's not enough people, right? So you're going to have to find a way to coalesce and come together to create a consolidated whole, so that any employer sees you as bigger than just a small unit, but sees you as part of a larger thing. And so I know in Mississippi, there is some work that's been done around Starkville and what they call the Golden Triangle, I think they call it, where they have all come together and they've said, we are one unit, and if a business locates in one of our towns, we all benefit. The same thing has happened here in Georgia, and I can't tell you exactly the counties, but I will tell you that the legislature is very concerned about this. And I met with some freshman legislators, and they're forming a rural economic development committee to look at exactly these issues. And we're going to try to be as connected with them as possible. But this notion of scale, this notion of understanding where your comparative advantages are, and also if there's a way that you can get your institutions to be willing to provide specialized skills to serve employers, that's another strategy that can be quite helpful.
One more question.
Yep.
What are the benchmarks that you use for the health of a small business community?
Benchmarks for the health of a small business community. So there are many. One would be sort of the rate of entrepreneurship. Another would be the flow of small business capital in terms of lending, but also venture and investment capital. Some would be the growth in businesses to have them have some degree of scale. So and this is not directly related to your question, but we're looking at the question of in Atlanta, how many small businesses there are, how many have more than 5 employees. And I think 95% of all small businesses in the Atlanta region have less than 5 employees. And so if you want to look at them as anchors of a community, they don't have the scale to do that. So trying to find, trying to assess the extent to which the small business community is broad, but also has some depth, is something that's also quite important.
Is Savannah doing okay?
So I have not looked at the statistics on Savannah, but I have my folks here. We will definitely look at that. Savannah is interesting because you have the port, which is large, you have a lot of aerospace, which is significant, and then you have the travel and tourism, and they really function at different parts of the wage distribution, and so trying to find ways to get to that middle space so that you can serve a broader set of the population, that's a challenge. And so I've been here for a couple hours. I will be back, and hopefully with each return, I'll get a much deeper sense of where things are working and where there are really opportunities for improvement. And I think I'm out of time. So thank you all. I really enjoyed talking with you.